Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, Wendigo stories. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with s'mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond, not far from her house, where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen, and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the story she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legends seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chucked as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built, 1,000 square foot, on each side, duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do.
I'm trapped.
Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Second story. Don't go Christmas tree hunting after dark in northern Canada. When I was growing up, every Christmas we would go out hunting for a tree. The perfect one, just the right size to put up in our living room. It was always an excursion, going out into the countryside, crammed into the snow-covered car in our winter wear. My mom and dad, my brother Noel and I, the four of us were an unstoppable team, heading out into the white wilderness to find that one ideal specimen to hack down and drag home with us, so that we could decorate it in tinsel and cover it with ornaments, lights, and all the works. Every year it was our tradition, until one year it wasn't anymore. Dad passed away a couple years back, and with all this pandemic business, it doesn't look like we'll be doing much as a family this Christmas for the first time I can remember. It was with this feeling of melancholy and neglected nostalgia in mind that I hopped into my car on a whim and drove out into the snow-covered countryside to find a Christmas tree. The whole thing was a bit out of the ordinary for me, but I was feeling stir-crazy sitting in my apartment. I had just been quarantined for a week due to an exposure at work and had finally gotten back the negative test results and subsequent all clear to venture outdoors again. After days of Uber Eats, watching reruns and old Christmas movies, I could finally leave my house. I couldn't remember where the place was that we had gone to as kids, so I just drove around until I found a farm with a sign out front. It took a couple hours, but I liked that lost feeling, that sense of misdirection that none of us experience anymore since we all have GPS and cell phones. I had turned my phone off and put it in my glove box, vowing not to use it for the trip, instead just wandering until I finally found that sign I was looking for. Christmas trees, it read $1.40 each, bring your own saw. Bios. Perfect, I thought, just like the old days. I pulled into the frozen gravel lot and parked. It was getting a bit late in the day, so the few people in the parking lot were already tying trees to the roofs of their cars or throwing them in the backs of pickup trucks. Better hurry, said a man in a flannel shirt and overalls as I got out of my car. Gets dark early nowadays. Don't want to be stuck out there after the sun goes down. Gets cold quick in these parts. I was immediately struck by his intimidating height. Being 6'5" myself, I don't often run into someone taller than me. He looked down at me, and I thought he had to be above 7 feet tall. His skin was stretched taut over prominent cheekbones, and he appeared emaciated and malnourished. Thanks, I said. I haven't done this since I was a kid. Hopefully I still remember how to work a hacksaw. He looked at me crooked for a second, then smiled in a slightly creepy way. His teeth were yellow and nicotine-stained. His eyes looked yellow as well, his skin rough and covered in sores. You never forget how to use a hacksaw. It's like riding a bike. But remember what I said about the darkness and the cold. You from around here? Yeah, more or less. Why? He watched me for another second, chewing a wad of something sticky and brown in his mouth as he did. Just make sure you're back at your car by sundown. Lots of animals out, and not much to eat this time of year. What kinds of animals? All kinds. Wolves, coyotes, other things too. I assumed he was the unstable owner of the place, and guessed by his comments that he was slightly insane. One of his eyes was looking at me, and the other was staring off into the distance. The parking lot was soon abandoned as all the other cars seemed to leave at the same time as I prepared to go out. Trudging through the snow, bundled up with my hacksaw in hand, I proceeded into the forest of Christmas trees, and he stood and watched me go. Near the parking lot, the trees were all too large to fit in my living room. It took a while to get into the decent ones, and I found a lot of the best specimens had been taken. This one had a hole the size of a basketball in the bows. That one was already starting to turn brown and looked sick. Too small, too large, too skinny, too tall, too fat, wouldn't fit. Before I knew it, I realized I was having trouble seeing where I was going. The sun had been subtly setting behind my back. I tripped over something and fell in the snow. When I got up, my gloves were damp, and I realized my feet were starting to feel numb. It was suddenly getting very cold. Okay, I thought to myself, just pick one and get out of here. All of the trees looked sick and dying. I realized now. They were missing large sections, and none of them looked suitable for use. I settled on a random one after another couple minutes and quickly hacked it down with the saw. By the time I was done, it was pretty much completely dark outside. I thought again about the man's warning to return to my car before it got dark and started to get nervous and wonder why he had been so insistent. Perhaps there are wolves, a voice in my mind said, or bears. Maybe there are wendigos. Why did I have to think about that? As I walked through the knee-deep snow, dragging the sick-looking little tree behind me, I remembered what I had read about them. Wendigos were a creature first mentioned in Canadian First Nations folklore, and I had once done a project on them for school. I discovered through my research that a Wendigo is an evil, malevolent spirit. It is fueled by greed and loves the cold. It prefers its victims hungry, like those found in remote regions during winter months. It possesses people and causes Wendigo psychosis, a condition diagnosed by psychiatrists. Symptoms include cravings for human flesh. Those who are possessed want to eat people. For every person the creature kills and consumes, its gaunt and skinny frame grows taller, thus never feeling satisfied. It is towering in its height, thin and human-like, but motivated only by greed and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Wendigo tend to appear in the winter when food is scarce. They love the cold. They are drawn in by starvation and ice-cold freezing despair. My stomach rumbled with hunger. Snap out of it, I told myself. I thought I heard something. Footsteps in the snow behind me. I stopped walking and turned around quickly to look. No one. I began to walk again. The darkness was nearly total, but my eyes had adjusted enough not to trip as I trudged along through the deep snow, dragging the tree by its trunk. That was when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time. Movement of another person walking in the snow. I turned around and the sound stopped, but I had been sure that time. Someone was following me. Hello? I looked around, scanning the shadows in the direction where I had heard the noise. Is someone there? No one. Hesitantly, I turned around and began to march again, my thighs now numb from the cold. My toes had gone from a wet and frozen pins and needles sensation I associated with childhood tobogganing excursions to now suddenly feeling painful and dead. The temperature had plunged rapidly. I hadn't checked the forecast, but this seemed unnatural. It felt like it was minus 30 degrees Celsius. My breath plumed out in the air in front of me, and my hands began to shake involuntarily. Suddenly my teeth were chattering and I was having trouble walking, my legs not wanting to move. The sound was coming behind me again, much closer now. I turned around, and this time it didn't stop. It didn't try to hide. The thing coming at me looked very much like the man from the parking lot, but he was no longer human. Maybe he never was in the first place. His plaid shirt was torn, and it looked like he had grown taller than before, and was now pushing 8 feet. Jaundiced eyes full of hate and hunger stared at me as he raced towards me, his long legs making him move quickly in the snow. For a moment I was frozen there, in more ways than one. It felt like the closer he got, the colder it was. And if anything propelled me to escape from him, it was that. I didn't want to feel that freezing dread for 1 second longer. It felt like death. My heart racing, I dropped the tree and ran. The fear I felt as I raced through the snow was indescribable. Have you ever been so afraid that your body doesn't feel real anymore? Your muscle memory doing everything for you, telling your body to run, and you don't even have time to think. You just run. The problem is when there's an 8-foot tall Wendigo chasing after you, and they're obviously hungry and fast as hell. That's when it doesn't matter how quick you can run, because you're still gonna die. I heard him gaining on me, and I knew if I looked back I would die. Just that brief momentary lack of focus would be enough to cause my demise. My heart skipped a beat as I felt it swipe at my clothing and nearly grab a hold of me, and I realized I would never get away by running like I was. I could hear its breath behind me, very close, breathing heavily as it ran. Headlights flashed suddenly, illuminating me, and I heard the Wendigo scream and duck away. The parking lot was to my left, I realized. I had reached it just as the creature was about to grab hold of me. It would have still if not for this one random person pulling into the parking lot. I heard the Wendigo running off back into the trees, clearly terrified of the light. My heart hammering, I walked towards the parking lot. I wanted to thank whoever was in the car, since they had saved me. Even if it hadn't been intentional, it had happened. Interestingly, the car looked familiar. I realized as I walked over to it. My older brother Noel rolled down his window, and the expression on his face revealed a total lack of surprise or any other emotion. "Noel, you saved me, man. Thank you." There was something chasing me out there in the woods. "A Wendigo?" he asked. "Yeah, how did you know? And how did you know I was out here?" "Mom told me you went looking for a tree, and there's only a couple places you can go these days. I got worried about you. Don't you remember what Dad always told us?" The memories started to flood back to me. I had forgotten what my father had warned us over and over again. No wonder the advice from the man in the parking lot had been so familiar. "Never go hunting for Christmas trees after dark," I said. "But what does that have to do with Wendigos?" "Man, think about it. Those guys love the cold, right? And they love when people are hungry. What are the two things you always remember feeling when we went looking for Christmas trees as kids?" My stomach rumbled again, louder this time. Why had I skipped dinner before coming out here? Point taken. My whole body is completely frozen solid, totally numb, and I'm starving. "Follow me," he said. "I'll drive to the nearest burger place, and we'll get a bite to eat and get you warmed up." I got into my car with one last parting glance at the woods. Yellow eyes gleamed from the darkness. Maybe I'll get the veggie burger for a while. Third story. Dear woman, I really wish I had some kind of explanation for this. I'm a rational person. It's not that I don't believe in the paranormal. I do. It's just that I think most of the time, there's a more mundane reason behind events other than ghosts or demons did it. Even though I've had plenty of my own paranormal experiences, I'm not one to jump to conclusions. That's why the story of Dear Woman surprised me. That's why, hours after it happened, I still can't account for the events which took place last night. My daughter is 6 years old. She just turned at the beginning of June. She was born exactly 2 weeks before my own birth date, and in some ways, we are annoyingly alike. We're both headstrong. We love to read. And when you combine those traits, you get little girls who love scary stories and refuse to listen to adults when they say, "Maybe you should wait until you're older." For her birthday, I bought her a couple of scary books. The series is called Short and Shivery. They're sort of like the awesome scary stories to tell in the Dark series, except the artwork isn't nearly as cool. Every night since then we've been reading these stories together. At least, when she isn't at her dad's. He doesn't like scary stories, so it's a special thing that she and I bond over. Last night, I picked a shorter story. She was up past her bedtime and I was tired. I saw one called The Deer Woman, which was based off an old Poncan legend. I won't bore you with the details, but it goes a little something like this. Two brothers are attending a celebration over the recently successful buffalo hunt. One of the brothers spots an intensely beautiful woman who he's never seen before. She is dancing with the other women and wearing a white buckskin dress and has eyes so enchanting he can't look away. When she stretches out her hand to him, he is compelled to follow her. She leads him into the woods, but unbeknownst to either of them, the younger brother follows. He's not far behind when he hears a cry. By the time he finds his elder brother, he's dead, gored by some terrible beast. He consults the wise woman of the tribe, who tells him that the woman was in fact a spirit called Deer Woman. She is a terrible enchantress whose beautiful face hypnotizes men, forcing them to stare only into her eyes. It is because of this that they can't look down and see her feet, which are actually deer hooves which no moccasins will fit. The younger brother then organizes another dance. He has the men build high walls around the village and a gate made of tree branches. He tells the men not to look at the women's faces, only at their feet. Then he begins the celebration. The other men, predictably, can't keep their eyes off the beautiful women's faces, and so it is only the younger brother who finds Deer Woman kicking her hooves as she dances amongst his people. He tackles her. She transforms into a hideous beast, nearly killing him. Then she leaps over the wall, and by the time the other men can bypass the tree branch gate, they see only a giant deer bounding away in the moonlight. The legend ends on the note that the tribe never saw Deer Woman again, but that they heard news from travelers that other tribes were now having problems with the evil spirit. I didn't think it was a particularly scary story, but my daughter was unexpectedly affected by it. Twice during the night she came upstairs, calling to me that she was scared of the Deer Woman, thinking she was just trying to stay up later, a common tactic with her. I told her to go back to sleep. I wouldn't let anything hurt her, I said. I promised. This morning, my boyfriend went downstairs to help her get ready to go to his mom's. My daughter said again that she was afraid of the Deer Woman. My boyfriend gave a half-hearted, "Oh yeah," in response. But then she said, "She was in my room last night," and she pointed to her high ceiling where a bunch of dark smudges were strewn across the paint. They look a hell of a lot like deer prints. Fourth story. I hunt wendigos for a living. My last hunt wasn't a wendigo. Hi, I'm a 17-year-old wendigo hunter. I started because, well, that doesn't matter right now. I wanted to write down the encounters I had. Day one, I got called down to an abandoned house at the end of my street. I carried my daggers, made of silver. When I got down to the house, I heard it, a wendigo. At this time, my first hunt, I wasn't prepared. By the time I located the sick bastard, he had the advantage. I was pinned down and his mouth was almost on my neck. I managed to kick him off me, the back up. Wendigos are stupid sometimes. He stood up and roared, but he was focused on dinner, not the train that dismembered him on impact. I burned what was left of him and collected the ashes. Job done. Day 2 today I hunted cautiously, carrying my bow and daggers. I found it feeding on a deer in a tunnel. Thank God for rednecks. I shot an arrow to a rock. The wendigo looked at the rock. The trap was set. The wendigo walked over and I grabbed the explosives my neighbor gave me and I lit one and tossed it. The wendigo looked at me a bit too late. He was blown apart. Not much left because I put holy ash and silver shrapnel in the explosive. He wouldn't be getting up. Day 3, finally I got a call about the wendigo on the mountain. I went up there with a gift my neighbor. His shotgun he left me in his will. I have slugs in the barrels and extra in my pocket. I went up to the cliffside and found the cave. But these are smart ones. Yes, there are multiple. They manipulated the sounds of my sister. The one they killed. There was an old car next to their lair. Join us, hunt with us, stop killing your family. I yelled in reply. If you're my family then, I'll put you out of your mercy. I aimed at the car and fired. The explosion of the gas tank closed the cave off, but the alpha got out and attacked me. His claw slashed my leg. I still have the scar. I drew my dagger and put it in his neck and flipped over. His back's on the forest floor. I stood up and he did too. I unloaded a slug into his chest, sending him flying. I reloaded and splattered his head against the wall. The sick son of a bitch that took Elizabeth from me was dead. I dragged him home and burned him in the basement with stove. Day 4 today, I was called to investigate some dead swimmers in the stream, cuts and parts of their body carved off. This was not a Wendigo. I prepared for one hell of a hunt. I went to the waterfall and got ambushed by a massive wolf, a skinwalker. I stuck a knife in the wolf's neck and it recoiled. I grabbed the shotgun and fired, knocking it back. I ripped the knife out and kicked it down the waterfall. I pulled out my dad's .44 Magnum and put a bullet in the thing's head, between the eyes. My one bullet was a silver hollow point filled with poisons, cyanide, and wolfsbane. The tip melted when blood got into contact. The tip was mercury and the skinwalker fell. Cyanide and wolfsbane destroying his brain and heart, mercury attacking his blood. I left him for Wendigo bait. They would fall for something this big any day. And that's where we are now. I got a report of some chupacabra sightings down south, so if I come back, I'll make sure to tell you guys. This is Codename Joker. Signing off. 5th story. Watch for deer. The roads are different at night. It's something my mom used to say all the time. She said it when I was a child in the back seat, and she said it when she was teaching me how to drive. Every stretch of highway or back road turn was different under the veil of darkness. I laughed at the concept at first, thinking maybe she was overreacting a little. I had just got my license, and I had driven many times before, but they had all been convenient daylight drives in the past. I thought surely as long as I had a GPS and working headlights, everything would be fine. In the end, her words rang true, and it was something I learned the hard way. My 18th birthday was 2 months ago. I was working a part-time day shift job as a dishwasher at a country club since I had graduated high school. It wasn't a bad job, and it taught me the value of earning and appreciating your paycheck. I found that, despite my hate for school, I actually enjoyed working and making money to provide for myself instead of just hanging around and existing. My mom or my sister would pick me up after work in the family beater, an old Dodge Intrepid, so they could run errands and whatnot while I was at work. We didn't have a lot of money, and I was helping out around the house with what I made as a dishwasher. But that all changed when I ran into my cousin at the country club. He had offered me a job, making twice as much where he worked. My cousin Scott was a steel worker. It sounded exciting to me at the time. A dangerous job, farther away from home than I was used to, lots of overtime, and bigger checks. I didn't have any plans for college, and I didn't have anything else lined up employment-wise, so it seemed like a lifeline when he offered it to me. It would be my first big boy job, and I couldn't help but think of the dollar signs swirling through my head. "It'll be good for you," he said. "You can get an early start, make some good money, try to get things on track. Make it through probation, and you'll have a steady job to hunker down at for a bit. After an application, a ride to a job interview, and a drug test, I was on my way to doing just that. I would start as a laborer doing grunt work, and when a bid came up, I might have a chance to move into something a little more concrete. I put in my notice at the dish pit, bought some steel-toe boots and some heavy cargos to wear until uniforms came in, and finished my 2 weeks with impatience. I would start out on second shift, working 3 to 11, and probably get forced into some overtime, but I was cool with it. Once my notice was up, I said goodbye to the friends I had made at the country club and got ready for bigger and better things. With a new job starting, my mom said I would take the Intrepid myself, just in case I had to work way later than scheduled. She was worried about being out so late, and more importantly driving at night. The mill was in a port 20 miles away, whereas my previous job was just down the road. There were only two ways to get there: the expressway that would get me there faster, or the back road that went through the dunes that led to the port. My mother said the highway was out of the question, too many crazy people on the roads, and the fact I had never driven at night made her very uncomfortable. She said I would take the scenic route. It was covered in trees and traffic was light, and I would be fine as long as I watched for deer. I was nervous and excited, but before I knew it, I was on my way for my first day. I plugged my phone into the AUX cord. Since my phone was an old hand-me-down, I had to find a sweet spot for it to come in clearly. I set my GPS and put on some music and started the heavily wooded cruise. On my way to work, the drive was beautiful. The trees were tall and danced in the wind, rays of sunshine shining down all the way to the port. It was a more touristy route, I suppose, being so close to the lake. Gift shops and gas stations could be seen every couple miles, and there were several elderly men taking their project cars out for a Sunday drive on a Monday. At the halfway point in my drive, I caught a red light. The intersection was small, with an old train station next to it with a sign that read Sandy Shores. There was a couple on a bench outside the station, cheesy smiles beaming as they posed for a selfie. It all seemed so serene, this beautiful drive, on the way to my much more profitable job, seeing these nice cars that maybe one day I would be able to afford. I looked forward to making this drive in the days to come. With my tunes playing on the stereo, nice easy speed limit, and lazily listing turns, I found my way to work and got to my first day. The port itself was the farthest thing from beautiful. It seemed like a decaying hole in the land. Nothing but dusty gravel, loud semi-trucks, and loud bangs echoing from the factories on every corner. I parked next to the other soot-covered cars and headed in. After getting my own hard hat and shown around, I was led to my station, where I would spend the next 8 hours putting bands on stacks of plate and verifying skid tickets. Some people were rougher than others, but the night crew seemed to be more populated with a younger crew, so I blended in just fine. I ended up with a guy named Terry, someone a few years older than me, who showed me the ropes and made sure I was out of people's way. He was a pretty cool guy, hardworking and priding himself in being an overtime hog. The job was a little stressful, but the banter in between packaged loads made it a little easier. Despite the intimidation of the overhead cranes and loud percussion of the machines, I focused on the tasks at hand and doing the best I could. I wanted to impress management so I wouldn't get axed during my probation. The day seemed to fly by. Halfway through the shift, the supervisor let me know Terry and I were getting low man to stay over a few hours after the shift to pick up the warehouse. Something about cleaning up to install cameras for the line. Terry was pleased and said he would have volunteered anyway. It was seniority-based overtime, so if I wanted to keep my job, I didn't really have a choice. Even though the shift was extended, it went pretty quick. The labor was way less monotonous than doing dishes all day. I was told I could wrap it up for the day and head home. Terry said he would stay and try to milk it a little longer, and after a fist bump I punched out and it was time to go home. I was feeling extremely accomplished and optimistic. That was until I got to the parking lot. It was dark outside. Very dark. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for my car, Terry's, and the supervisor's. Out in the port, the air was chillier and more eerie than back home. It even felt darker ***, like I didn't belong there. Trying to maintain my high spirits, I walked to my car, which was now covered in the dust that blew around all day. I got in, started it up, and plugged my phone back into the AUX so I could hear the GPS and music on my way home. I texted my mom that I was on my way, and after picking a song I was ready to go. It shouldn't be too bad, I told myself, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I prepared to cross another milestone in the same day. Driving home at night, leaving the port was just as different at night. Instead of the sun lighting everything up, there was just a row of orange lamps lighting the way out. A few semis were shouldered for the night, drivers that were sleeping to get the jump on the next load first thing in the morning. It seemed so desolate compared to earlier this morning. As I drove through the exit and back on the scenic route that would take me back the way I came, I realized that the orange lights in the port would be the last of my light for a while. Once I left, it was just me on the road, my old beater car chugging away into the night. It wasn't too bad. The visibility was a little worse than I thought, but at least I had the GPS and music. The drive was only a half hour. Before I knew it, I would be back home and showering after my first long day of work. Entering the wooded portion of my drive felt like driving into a cave. The tall trees leaning over the road blocking out even the slightest hint of moonlight. I focused on the drive ahead, the worn AUX input crackling over my music. Each bump in the road seemed rougher than before, each branch reaching just a little further in the headlights. I white-knuckled the wheel as I drove, feeling silly for being as on edge as I was. It was just a short drive. What was the big deal? Everybody drove at night. People did it all the time. Each winding curve seemed to turn into the same repetitive stretch of trees, like I was driving through the same segment over and over again. Time seemed to crawl as my car chugged down the road, the high beams reflecting off every sign as I made my way. Old, beat-up signs for no passing, signs warning of a low shoulder, signs for deer crossing. It looked at them all one by one, my eyes lingering long on the yellow square with the silhouette of a buck prancing. Watch for deer. To my surprise, there wasn't much to watch out for, except for the trees. Just when I thought I wasn't making any progress, I found myself at the same intersection from earlier, caught at the same red light. I slowed to the inevitable stop and sat waiting, my progressive rock drumming against long-blown speakers. My eyes drifted from the road in front of me to the train station, the sign for Sandy Shores, not lit with a flickering neon. The bench with the couple I observed earlier now stood empty under a lamp post, littered with discarded trash from the commuters throughout the day. There wasn't a soul in sight. No other cars. Nobody else making a trek somewhere in the middle of the night. It just felt so dark. I checked the GPS as I sat. I only had 12 minutes until I reached my destination. The drive was practically over already. As I looked down to my phone, I saw the green glow fill the cab as the light changed. I eased off the brake and continued. I thought of the work I did prior and how my muscles were sore in a way I had never felt before. My joints ached differently, like I had spent all day log rolling down a hill. I thought of a hot shower and washing away the dirt and rust that circulated through the air of the plant as the production line ran. As fulfilled as it made me feel, in the back of my mind I wondered how people did something like that every day for work. I guessed I would just get used to it. Ahead I saw a pothole and the headlights glow, one I wouldn't be able to swerve away from in time. The passenger side tire hit it dead center, the impact rocking the entire car on its shot suspension. I winced at the crater in the pavement, and the crackling in the music got worse as the AUX lost its sweet spot. The grinding distortion in the stood my hair up as I reached for the cord and found nothing but an empty seat. I felt for my phone in the dark, my fingers trying to trail the cord to the source. "Come on," I said, fumbling in the dark. After several attempts, I couldn't quite find the phone. Like my hand wasn't making the connection to my brain what it was supposed to be. Look, I saw the eyes and the reflection of the fur too late, and I slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed as I flew toward the baby deer, my entire body seizing like a frozen statue. I could only squeeze the steering wheel and stomp my foot as hard as I could, unable to totally alter the momentum of the car. I stopped suddenly, but not fast enough, the car screeching to a halt just late enough to smack the fawn with the front bumper. The hit was quick but solid, and I watched in denial as the young animal was tossed off its hooves and tumbled down the road in front of me. I grit my teeth so hard they hurt. I looked at the body dumbfounded. It had happened so fast, there was no way it could just come out of nowhere. I didn't have enough time. Even if I wasn't distracted, there was no way I could have. How was I supposed to? The static was worse through the stereo. My phone lost somewhere in the abyss that was the passenger side floor. The cord had followed it, and it hung from the jack at a sharp angle like a tugged fishing line. I sat there with my jaw hanging, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to think. Before I had the time to even process what had happened ahead of me, another bright shape echoed off the headlights. Another deer with big ears and a shiny coat had walked into the road slowly, like it couldn't believe what it was seeing. With hesitant steps it crossed the pavement, and as I painstakingly watched it nudge the motionless body with its snout, I came to the horrifying conclusion of what I was looking at. Its mother. Ahead of me, the majestic plump doe nudged the still corpse of its child, and as it registered what it had found, promptly erupted in the saddest cries of pain I have ever heard from an animal. With its head whipping around in desperation, it called to the woods surrounding us, its calls echoing through the trees and chilling me to the bone. Its loss, the emotion it felt, was brought on by me, and the guilt washed over me like a smothering plague. I couldn't think. I could only watch. I watched helplessly, wanting to do something, but the cruel realization settled quickly. What could I possibly do, other than run down its child? How could I possibly help the situation I had caused? From the passenger floor, my phone struggled against its lack of proper connection. The grinding static was worse and assaulted my ears, but I didn't dare look for my phone now. I could only look ahead at the grieving doe and the child I ran down. Over my convenience of musical reception, I thought about calling someone, maybe calling my mom, but then what? She would be asleep, and when she woke up there would be a cataclysmic uproar, and even then, I had the only car. It's not like she could come get me. I swallowed hard, and after what felt like an eternity of mulling it over, I decided the only thing my piece of shit self could do in a situation like this, I would try to go around them and drive away. I felt the tears welling in my eyes and my nose starting to run as I readjusted my grip. My foot was still stuck against the floor, so I started easing off the brake, committing to my decision to flee. Before I could let off, however, I heard a faint tap on my window. When I turned to my window, my blood went cold. Staring at me through was a giant set of glass-like eyes, belonging to a large 18-point buck. With wide, bulky shoulders, it stood in the entirety of the oncoming lane, hunched down so it could look through my window. Its antlers reached far from the sides of its head, each pronounced point bulbous with velvet. After a deep inhale, it snorted into the chilly air, fogging the glass that seemed so thin under its size. The dark pupils were entrancing and terrifying, like the inside of the car was shrinking under their gaze. "I am sorry. I didn't mean. It just happened. I'm sorry," I mumbled to the large stag, my hands shaking on the wheel. The swirling fear pulled at my gut, and I felt like I was going to piss myself if I didn't look away. For only a second I looked at the doe and its child in front of me, my sense of flight wondering if I could chance it and take the shoulder off road and get past them. The groaning AUX continued on the floor, the cord begging to be adjusted or pulled free altogether. I looked to the giant deer in desperation, wanting to apologize more, but knowing it would be useless. Only when it raised its head did I realize it wasn't looking at me but past me, to the other side of the car. I followed its gaze and saw another of the herd had crept up, a younger male from the looks of it, 2 little velvet points sticking from its head. It investigated the car as it walked up, timidly observing the shape of the car before looking inside. It looked at me, then at the elder, exchanging their unsettling silent glare on opposite sides. As I was caught in the middle, the doe ahead let out another pained wail. The great deer exhaled again, spreading the fog on the window. It tipped its nose to the younger deer, and I watched as it fluttered its ears. The younger one started looking into the car, its head panning the interior as the older one watched. The static on the radio came in and out, like a radio station tuning. After a moment it paused and stared at something in the dimly lit cab. It didn't make sense to me. On my left the elder was looking at the same thing. At first I thought it was the dash, but they weren't looking quite at it. Slowly I realized it wasn't the glow of the radio they were transfixed on. They were looking at the keys. In a fit of panic, I reached for the switch next to me and locked the doors. A second later, the younger deer lowered its head and hooked one of its nubs on the door handle and jerked up, trying to work the latch. The loud knocks of the handle slapping were loud, and I jumped, and the larger deer snorted angrily. It looked at the lock on the windowsill in a way that I could only explain as pure anger. I blindly felt for my phone again and was painfully reminded it was still on the floor. The radio cackled as I fumbled with the cord, and I could swear I could hear words over the frequency. It was barely audible, but I could swear it sounded like, "Let us in." The larger deer stared at me again, and without warning, smacked its antlers on the window. I jumped at the sound of it, and I prayed to God the glass would hold. I looked forward again, at any possible route to drive away. With them boxing me in, I would have no choice but to swipe one of them, or run into the mother directly. The larger one smacked the window again, this time busting the velvet, leaving a gritty red splotch on the fogged glass. It drug it across the window, making a dark smear as the bony point scraped along. Ahead, the doe rested its head on its still offspring, its chest heaving with human-like crying. Tears streaked down its fur, and at the sight of it was like I could hear the sobbing. Inside the car, over the radio, "Let us in," or "Let him in." I tried to reach for my phone again. I chanced to glance at the floor, and I could see the outline of it on the floor in the far corner. I gently pulled on the AUX cord, and the distortion worsened with every tug, assaulting my ears. I tried to turn off the radio, but it wouldn't work, the volume and source buttons only yielding the same digital error message on the display. The larger deer was rattling its rack against the window faster now, a bleeding mess trailing behind the shredding velvet. The younger deer pressed the side of its face against the passenger side window, its dark eyeball pressing against the glass as it tried to look in as close as it could. The mother deer's crying could be heard over the radio. There was a menacing chorus rising in the static, something that was trying to push through. The human crying was so loud it was like a woman sobbing in the back seat, sobbing in my ear. I looked at the window with the larger deer, with the array of bloody streaks, and as the streaks seemed to take shape, the crying and the chorus grew louder. The streaks weren't just random nudges, it was drawing something. It was drawing a pentacle. With the last crude stroke that completed the crimson star and circle formation, There was a fog rising from the ditch on the side of the road. The mother doe buried her face into the lifeless fawn like it was trying to hide. Now that the crying had subsided, the chorus seemed clearer, and it hit me that it wasn't singing or anything like it. It was screams. Horrible, tortured screams. Through the billowing fog, a wicked amalgamation of antlers jutted from the damp leaves and grass. With bright red rays it tore through the earth, the sounds of 100 screaming souls droning over the radio as the rack poked through. The volume on the radio kept turning up. I covered my ears to thwart the punishing sound. The deer on both sides of me just stared in my anguish, the sound rising a pitch so great I thought the windshield would shatter. As the deer stared, I could see their faces began to shake, like a movie stuck on fast forward. Their eyes rattled in their skulls as their faces blurred, the speakers in the car whining under the strain of hopeless cries and pleas. The phalanx of antlers gave way to fur, wrapped around a skull bigger than a moose. Through the cold mud it steamed in its ascent, whether it was torn velvet or strips of flesh hanging from its points, I was not sure. They dangled like drying strips of meat. Beside me the deer shook so fast their features distorted, some of them animal, others human. It matched the screams coming through the radio. As the full bust of shiny black fur was through the ground, the fog wisped away as if on fast forward as well. The head of the giant deer opened its eyelids to reveal 2 bleeding spheres the size of baseballs, its jet-black pupils narrowing in on me, cowering behind the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, wondering when I had started to scream. My scream blended with the others, one and the same. The screaming stopped. I sat there with my hands over my ears, my eyes squeezed shut, afraid to open them again. I heard the snort once again, and it was a moment before I gave in and looked in its direction. The large deer was still there, but it wasn't looking at me anymore. The screaming was gone. The bloody pentagram was gone. The mysterious fog and the shadowy black deer were gone. I lowered my hands to see the younger buck was looking as well, its ears fluttering with excitement. Not only were they not looking at me, they were walking away. Ahead of me, the fawn I had hit just minutes ago was blinking awake, confused and disoriented. After a struggle, it stumbled to its feet with the help of its mother, and weakly stood on its own after a few licks and prods with her nose. The large buck snorted and nodded at the baby, and after a moment of consideration, it nodded back. The large male gave an approving snort and turned to the mother, who nodded as well. I watched them in silence, not even sure what to do anymore. All at once they looked at me, a family of 4, their many glassy eyes reflecting in the headlights. I put my hands up in defeat. I couldn't help but stare back, my hands shaking as they huddled closer together. With a snort, the large male nodded, once at me, then once to the open road behind them. I didn't believe it. Slowly they moved together, giving me enough room to drive past them. I hesitated, but not for long. As soon there was enough room, I let off the brake and started driving, creeping past the family herd as they watched me go. I gave an apologetic look at the baby, who returned it with twinkling eyes. As soon as I was clear of them, my foot pressed the accelerator, and I got the hell out of there. Even though I was clear, I couldn't help but look in the rear-view mirror behind me to make sure they weren't chasing me. I wish I would have just kept my eyes forward instead of behind me. They watched me go in silence, their dead stares unblinking as my car got further and further away. Just as they were almost out of view, they stood up on their hind legs, one by one, until they were all upright with their front legs at their sides. The mother and fawn walked away first, with the younger buck following close behind. The father stayed, however, his stare following until all I could see was an open stretch and trees behind me. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.